Okay, so we started with just kind of throwing the term post-transgender around, but then quite quickly moved on to discussing Tasha's paper and whether it makes sense to label children explicitly as cis. We brought up a post by Natalie Reid as cis as the null hypothesis, which means that unless it's proven otherwise, it's part of cisgenderism to assume that everyone is cis, and you need quite a lot of evidence to say otherwise, that someone is not cis. And we started thinking about that actually what we call cis, as in not trans, actually encompasses a range of cis identities. So there are people who would be labelled cis but are ambivalent about it, or might not strongly identify as their assigned gender, or just generally uncomfortable with being their assigned gender, but not quite so much as to claim a trans identity. So then, where do you put the line between trans and someone who's not particularly bothered about their assigned gender? And what are the implications of this for identities like agender and genderqueer? And ultimately, we kind of thought that gender pluralism and having a range of genders and a range of gender options open to people is an important concept, because then you have a multitude of ways of identifying and engaging with gender. Then we talked a bit about terminology, and if I can borrow...
Oh no.
Huh? Yeah.
I said oh no.
And kind of, what does it mean if we have trans with an asterisk as opposed to trans without the asterisk? And I'll just let Alex take a picture of that. So what this tends to mean is trans as being short for lots of things. The asterisk is a wild card, which means it can be short for transsexual, for transgender, for trans man, trans woman, and so on, basically. So and then sometimes it's also used to explicitly distance that kind of set of identities from trans without the asterisk as being kind of short for trans identities that involve transitioning, so things like transsexuals. And we just kind of started wondering about why have these labels, and giving them as giving people a sense of belonging and commonality. And if you have that, then there seems to be a dynamic where people who don't quite fit your version of trans, or who are a slightly different flavour, kind of people within that group feeling threatened by this, sometimes for quite obvious reasons about concerns over access to medicine or legal protection. So if you're transsexual and you fought incredibly hard to have access to medical care, then how would you feel about people who are also trans but were quite firm about not wanting access to hormones, for example? Are you going to feel worried that this might affect your continued ability to get access to medical care? So just some of the tensions within that trans community. And then we started talking about kind of moving up, deviating slightly from trans as everyday culture to trans as a medical diagnosis as well as an identity. So people who are uncomfortable with transsexual as an identity label, but still being given that diagnosis. And we started talking about whether gender identity clinics were starting to allow for genderqueer identities and how these fitted into their care pathways. So what does a genderqueer real life experience look like? And then if that's predicated upon androgyny, and androgyny as appearance rather than a subjectivity, that's immensely problematic. But then we also started thinking about people who transition but who won't necessarily be read as a cis person after transition, and whether this creates space for other kinds of transition to happen. And then continuing in this medical vein, that is an unintentional pun, I'm really sorry. So where do kind of trans clinicians working in trans medicine actually learn from? And trans as a culture creates new knowings and new ways of knowings in which plural identities can exist. And if there's space in society for such plural genders, then the impetus is for gender identity clinics to allow, say, genderqueer transitions because there is a space for such to exist. At the moment, part of the resistance against that seems to be, well, if we allow you to transition to genderqueer and access the hormones or surgery that you may want, then what are you going to do after that? How are you going to make your gender intelligible to the rest of the world who may not know what genderqueer is? And then going back, Natasha's just gone, but we started talking about trans children and how they're treated, and not just as allowing them to have a social and cultural space to be trans, but also clinically, so allowing for hormone blockers to allow that kind of temporal space to work out whether they want hormones and not being kind of pressured into either a kind of trans puberty or a cis puberty. We also talked a bit about the comorbidity issue of if autistic spectrum children are less constrained by social norms, and if there's I think 13% instance of comorbidity there, then surely that also indicates that actually there are a lot of trans children out there who are constrained by these gender norms. So there's a lot more trans children out there than we imagine. And then we just kind of talked a bit about Ruth and Kirsty's research. So they actually found that the groups they examined were relatively diverse in terms of disability, race and class. And there was perhaps something about the intersection of trans cultures and alternative cultures that meant that these things were kind of more prevalent in that particular intersection than in fact alternative cultures or trans cultures on their own. And also just talked a bit about how kind of trans spaces were also welcoming for cis people, in that once you've broken assumptions about gender, then there's room for a lot of questioning of other things and not necessarily taking kind of social assumptions for granted. So, oh gosh, there is a lot. So
you've got a couple of minutes.
I've got a couple of minutes, right. So, yeah, we then started talking a bit about there are people who should understand trans issues, particularly in terms of employment and in terms of law, and it would be in their interest to understand these issues, but it's still alien to them. And so obviously there's education through mass media, but we were also talking about education through activism and awareness of activism. So things like gender-neutral toilets, things like Subbus in Oxford, which was about being able to wear the clothes of your gender, of your identified gender, rather than what was on your student records. And then also gender-neutral toilets in Brighton. And we were surprised that the Daily Mail article was actually more neutral than expected, which for the Daily Mail is practically approval, really. And there was one trans woman who actually found it easier to navigate GPs and access to help if she had a title that made it obvious that she was gender non-conforming. Because if she used a female title like Miss, Mrs, Ms, then people kind of looked, oh, hang on a sec, who? Whereas if she had a gender-neutral title, they kind of went in with the expectation that she'd be somehow not looking exactly like a cis woman, and wouldn't necessarily be read as such. So this high-minded ideal that kind of comes from queer theory and comes from wanting to challenge these norms actually leads to having a really basic access available. So in Maslow's hierarchy of needs, access to healthcare is one of the very basic things before you can have these things like self-actualization. So in this case, this activism that might appear to be kind of slightly academic actually led to this improvement in someone's life. So I think that's about where we got up to. Thanks.